Katharine Graham was the owner and publisher of the Washington Post in the early 70s when Carl Bernstein and I did the Watergate stories. And we wrote these stories, and the truth was no one believed them. It seemed inconceivable that President Nixon and his people would be involved in the level of criminality that later was too well established, particularly with the tape. So it was January 1973, Katharine Graham invited me up for lunch in her dining room on the top floor of the Washington Post. And I had met her. She'd supported the publication of these stories, and came in. Carl had to go to a funeral that day, so he was not there. And I looked at her, and I later said that she had a kind of, "What have you boys been doing with my newspaper?" look on her face. And somebody said, well, what have you boys been doing with my newspaper look? And I said, if you were there, you would know it. And she then started interrogating me about Watergate coverage and blew my mind with what she knew. She actually at one point quoted something she'd read in the Chicago Tribune about Watergate. And I remember thinking, what the hell is she reading the Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does. But here, is the CEO gathering all this data, and it was a kind of style I would later describe, which I commend to anyone who has a leadership responsibility, and it is mind on, hands off. The leader, the CEO, needs to be intellectually engaged and know what's going on, but the CEO cannot. Like she couldn't say, this is the way to report, this is the way to edit. She had to stay her hand and keep her hands off. And so we're going through a discussion, really an interrogation of me. And then she finally said, well, when are we going to find out the whole truth of Watergate? And I said, well, because there was a well-funded cover-up going on. The 5 Watergate burglars who broke into the Democratic headquarters were being paid for this silence. When Carl and I went to visit people at their homes at night, people who had key positions, we often got the door slammed in our face, and there was a look not just of anxiety, but of panic on their faces, that the investigation into Watergate was not really strong. And so I said, Mrs. Graham, the answer to your question, when are we going to find out the whole truth, is never. Remember looking across the table, and she had this look of pain on her face, and she said precisely, never, don't tell me never. I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But what she said was, and this is what I think is important, was not a threat. It was a statement of purpose. And she said to me, she said, look, use all your resources as a reporter, use all the resources of this newspaper. She had taken on all the risk. And she said it was her job to take on that risk. And then she asked, and why? Why is it her job? And then she answered her own question and said, because that is the business we're in. Our business is to get to the bottom of things because this involves the President of the United States. We have a triple, quadruple responsibility to get to the bottom of this. I left that lunch, I was 29 years old at the time, and thought, wow, how great to work for an institution where the boss understands fully what the job is and is willing to take the risk to get that job done. And someday we're going to put a plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post, and it's simply going to begin quote marks. Never, don't tell me never, end quote. Catherine Graham.